All right. Welcome to the Ujamaa Hour, good people. Welcome to the Ujamaa Hour. I'm Michael Tekin Strode. We are broadcasting live within BIBA. BIBA stands for the Bridge Embassy for Black America, where we build and protect Black, where we stimulate not only the cooperative economic orientation around purchasing or buying Black or financial capital investment, but we talk about all of the different forms of capital that we have the capacity and the potential to invest in our communities. So thinking about those 8 forms of capital, thinking about that financial capital, that intellectual capital, our living or natural capital, our material or built environment, our cultural, our experiential, social, spiritual, all of these different forms of capital are things that we have the capacity to invest in our communities. And so when we get to this element of this cooperative economics that we are honoring on this day of Kwanzaa, this Ujamaa, we don't necessarily want to think about it simply from the basis of that financial capital. We want to make sure that we are stressing and embodying all of those different forms of capital inside of our community. Certainly on these episodes that we've been airing around the Ujamaa Hour, we've talked before about initially around cooperation. What is cooperation? How does cooperation show up in our communities? And how does it actually operate in terms of us developing as human societies, or specifically as Black people in America at present, and as African people throughout the diaspora. How does cooperation show up for us? How has it moved us forward as communities and as societies? We've talked about capital. So what is capital? Where does capital exist? How does capital transform from one form into another? And we've talked about economy. So economy as simply this systems of production, distribution, and exchange of resources. So again, cooperation, capital, economy. The next Movement Monday segment we'll be doing in January is going to be on autonomy. And hopefully we'll have Sister NYERERE Smith on here from Black Sovereign Nation out in Texas. So that's going to be an engaging conversation around moving from these 3 elements we've talked about so far of cooperation, capital, and economy, and thinking about how does that form into the development of autonomous communities? How does that look, in terms of the ways that the knowledge production that we generated from fugitives from enslavement? What does that sort of fugitivity factor in terms of how we've used these elements, cooperation, capital, and economy, to create autonomous spaces where we can actually live out our entire free identity, right? And so today we want to actually dig into, some of the layers of Ujamaa, specifically from the perspective of Nyerere's program in Tanzania, post-colonial Tanzania, of you really thinking about how, pardon me, yes, of really thinking about how we are engaging in economic development from a larger perspective, a larger framework. So oftentimes when we think about Ujamaa around Kwanzaa, we're thinking about specifically, and we're thinking very limited in terms of how we're building, individual businesses, or supporting individual families. And we're not necessarily thinking about how those things interlink together. So Nyerere offers a reflection from the past that we can draw forward, in that Sankofa principle, in terms of thinking about economic development. And then we can connect that to one of our current scholars, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, who's written a paper on building a Cooperative Solidarity Commonwealth, and thinking about how we are doing that in the present. What does that look like in the present world? And what are some models that we can actually be interlinking together in order to create this Cooperative Solidarity Commonwealth, which really is just Dr. Nembhard's way of saying that we can't just go around, developing individual cooperative entities. We've got to figure out how those things interlink and create an entire economic system, an entire sort of a different society, parallel to the one that exists now, but something that's going to be oriented towards a different set of values. And to help me unpack that, we've got the esteemed scholar, Brother Kamau Rashid, Dr. Kamau Rashid, that I'm going to bring into the line with me now, because we really want to kind of think about, again, what is Ujamaa on a larger sense, in a larger scale? And so I'm going to go ahead and loop Brother Rashid in with me now. Just a moment here. All right, brother, we got you looped in now.
Okay, excellent. How you doing today, good brother?
Oh, doing very well, very well. How about yourself, brethren?
Good, good, good.
Excellent. Excellent. So, if you could just maybe just do an introduction to maybe just a bit of background on your work, and then tie it into how you've been thinking about, Ujamaa and economy in terms of that work.
Okay, yes, sir. Yeah. So I teach. Well, I'm a member of the Comedic Institute of Chicago. I work with I'm also a member of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. I've worked in the past at the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the local Kawita study group. I work with a number of other men to coordinate a rites of passage program for young men called Akobim Rites of Passage Society. So my wife is an urban farmer, Your Bountiful Harvest Family Farm. So I work with her to help build this as an institution. And then just been a long-time advocate for African self-determination. I teach. My work professionally is to teach. I teach at National Louis University here in Chicago in Educational Foundations and Inquiry. And the second question is Ujamaa. What was the second part?
Yes. So relating how your work has been delving into economies and getting into the layers of what economies look like, and specifically how those economies relate to Black communities.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I appreciate that. As a scholar, I look at a number of things in my work, and one of the things that I examine is African thought. And I'm interested in African thought in its ancient and modern form. I'm interested in the capacity to which African thought can inform our thinking about how we solve our problems. And so one aspect of this, which has been a particular line of inquiry that has continued to shift and expand as time has gone on, is to think about this question of economic development. As you know, since the ending of the era of colonization, and this era and the inception of neo-colonialism, which is really what it is, we have seen various African leaders, as well as Black political leaders in the diaspora, in the Caribbean and other places, argue that our economies need to be developed, that we need development. And then I've been increasingly puzzled by what this means, because the consequence of development has been, in many instances, grotesque social stratification, rampant hyperaccumulation by the extreme wealthy, naked exploitation by multinational corporations, the looting of natural resources, environmental degradation, on and on and on. So this word development appears to be a misnomer, and I've argued that what we need to do is we need to think about, one, how our traditional thinking informs development, but also what ideas from that revolutionary generation, those people like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere and Amilcar Cabral, as well as people on this side of the water, people like Malcolm X and others, how do their ideas inform how we think about development? Because I argue that within their ideas may be the solution for many of these problems. So one of the things that I'm working on right now, in fact, is a book on W.E.B. Du Bois. And one chapter in their book, actually two chapters in the book, one chapter in the book deals with Du Bois and his critique of capitalism. A lot of people know that Du Bois had a critique of capitalism. Maybe they don't know he had a critique of capitalism, but he did. And he advocated for this thing called industrial democracy, which basically he argued that the economy, just like the system of government, has to be democratic. It has to be one which is answerable to the people, which is maybe considered a radical notion. And I'm putting radical in quotation marks. Right. I don't know what that means, how it's used. And then the other idea is Pan-Africanism. I'm looking at Du Bois as a Pan-Africanist, but I'm also looking at him in tandem with Nkrumah and Sheikh Anta Diop and Marcus Garvey. A lot of people don't know, but all four of these people had a concept of what the future could be for not just Africa, but the African world should be. And so these economic questions, these questions of what type of economic system would be most relevant towards maximizing the quality of life, the well-being of African people. These are questions which I think we both need to ask and answer. And in answering these questions, it may be necessary to go outside of this hyper-exploitative capitalist system in which we are presently mired.
Absolutely. So one of the things that is present both in Nyerere's essay on Ujamaa as the basis of African socialism, and then also in Dr. Nembhard's text, on the Cooperative Solidarity Commonwealth, is this this very challenging notion of a planned economy, right? So oftentimes, when we hear that, because of the fact that we've been reared in sort of this capitalist construct, and, we don't recognize that capitalism is an indoctrination process, right? Oftentimes we hear planned economy and it's like, oh my God, you mean you want the Soviet famine or something? So what how do you approach this notion that there might become a point in terms of how we get to equitable equitable economies where we might have to plan some things out. And that might, cause some folks not to be able to be acquisitive, as Nyerere actually pointed out in the essay as well.
Yeah. I think at the core of Nyerere's thinking was the idea. I mean, really, actually, if we dig into this, because at the core of Nyerere's thinking is this idea that within the context of Africa, that socialism should reflect the best of the social organization, the best of what, to use a Marxist term, the best of the political economy of the traditional African society. One thing that is important, it's not that there was not profit making in the traditional society. People made money, or they profited in money. That may be a different. Everybody didn't have currency, right? Mm-hmm. It's a monetized economy, but you did have economies where people were able to profit. But what's also clear is that the structures did not exist in these societies that allowed for hyperaccumulation. Hyperaccumulation is what happens in this era, right? Where you have Amazon, for instance. Amazon.com would be a classic example of hyperaccumulation. Gentrification is an example of hyperaccumulation, right? You have well-positioned banking and real estate and political interests who are able to direct the economic welfare of whole communities, whether that means pushing people out, whether that means creating optimal conditions to pull people in. We have hyperaccumulation in the energy sector, particularly fossil fuels, right? Especially as it relates to oil. So hyperaccumulation in economic system is generally dysfunctional. It's generally dysfunctional because it creates conditions which are antithetical towards human well-being. This is part of the reason why structures facilitative of hyperaccumulation would have never existed in the traditional society. And so my point is that in the traditional society, yes, in every place you wouldn't have had a state apparatus dictating, right, telling people what to do, but you had communal structures that in effect dictated what was necessary. Why? Because at its core, the economic system functioned on the basis of supplying the needs of people, right? I would argue that though certainly there may have been degrees of difference in how this was actualized in state structures. Say you take Kano, right, with the House of State. You have Kano in the other House of State. So you take Oyo, the Yoruba Empire, or you take the Igbo, who was stateless. I would argue that the expression of this would have been differentially manifest within different societies, because obviously in a society with the state can prioritize particular sectors of economic activity. You look at the Mali Empire, for instance, there was great prioritization around taxation, as taxation of trade routes, as well as salt and gold mining, even though to a large extent the gold mining occurred outside of the empire. But there was also this idea to align the function of the economy to the interests of the broader society. Within the context of the stateless societies, it would have been the same thing. Obviously, people need to eat. Obviously, people need housing. Obviously, people need medical care. The question is, how do we ensure that these things are both present but also accessible to people if we're interested in maximizing human well-being? The scale, especially of the stateless societies, which is why I think in many ways we really have to study the societies, particularly like the Igbo. The stateless societies offer us many, many, many lessons, because in societies like this, there was a direct understanding of the extent to which each individual was consequential to maximizing the capacity of the society to function. So the functionality of the society was as such. Well, we can't arbitrarily say, well, this percentage of the population, this aggregate of the population does not matter. Because this is what happens here, right? Mm-hmm. You have whole segments of the population who basically become obsolete when industries change, right? And they are downsized. But in the traditional society, I would argue that the structures did not facilitate this idea that we can simply render whole aggregates of the population obsolete, because we recognize that all of them have the capacity to contribute towards the welfare of the society or to its undoing. And so the society functioned in such a way so that, one, we ensure that we're able to meet the basic needs of all. That's why you have a lot of people say, and I don't know if it's a proverb or if it's just this sort of aphorism, people talk about there's no homelessness in the traditional African society, right? And so the way in which people live, you look at Ghana, you have families living in compounds. It's not just the nuclear families we have in the West, but extended family structures. So housing, healthcare, food, all occurred within the purview of the community to recognize individuals' contribution mattered. Therefore, these things had to be administered with a certain amount of oversight. whether it was the oversight of the elders of the community, as you would have as a governing structure, particularly among the Ebe people, or whether this oversight was from a more formal government apparatus, if we're talking about the states and empires. The point was that the economic trajectory of the society cannot be left to chance. And just to go back a bit, because I think when we talk about economy, people have to understand what economy is. The economy is basically the system that produces, distributes goods and services in the society. So it's the system of production and distribution of goods and services in the society, which means that every society has had an economy of some form or another. Now, one of the points that, well, maybe I should come back to that later on. But the point is that the economy is a vital institution of the society because food is necessary. So it's important just, but not only not to grow food, but to make sure that food is about the society. And so again, there has to be to ensure that everyone's needs are met. So when we talk about the centrally planned economy, yeah, I mean, again, for people who are habituated to thinking about economics in the sort of libertarian or worse yet, neoliberal terms, right, where there should be no fetters, it should be the market should rule, which in and of itself is a hegemonic idea. Part of the idea is that the society's institutions have to function in such a way that maximizes the human welfare, that enables the society to meet its basic needs and to grow and expand into the future in ways that reinforce human virtue and value.
So one of the things that I've been investigating lately is just thinking about I've been thinking of myself as a maroon economist. You know, I'm trying to figure out what maroon economies look like. So certainly we've talked about sort of historical tribal economies and how those look. But I'm also very interested in what happens when, you know, the boat gets to the other side of the water here. And then we recognize that, you know, we are in a state of resistance. We are in a state of, you know, of liberation at all times. And so once we liberate ourselves, you know, what are the types of economies that we build here? And, you know, what are the unique ways that we have generated knowledge about, you know, about how an economy should look once we got free, you know. So we recognize that in the Combahee River colony, you know, this colony forms, you know, after Harriet Tubman, you know, launches the raid on the Helena Bay, and then, you know, this colony forms, and they say we ain't ever gonna work for white people again, you know. And so what is so, you know, I'm just interested if you have any thoughts or any feedback or anything from your research, you know, that tells us about what, you know, economies look like in quilombos, you know, what economies might look like in sort of those liberated or free towns, you know, that were hedging themselves against, you know, slavery.
Yeah, I want to speak to that, but let me step back just a bit, just to deal with this idea of economies as a particular construct, because that's the thing that I think that's the thing that's implicit to what it is that you're talking about. People have to understand that the economy itself is a social construct. When we say that something is a social construct, we're not saying that it's not real. The economy is very real. I have a mortgage to pay. I have student loans to pay. If I don't pay my mortgage, I'll be out on the street. So the economy is a social construct, but it's also a real thing, right? Bound up or manifest in social institutions. But when I say it's a social construct, what this means is that economic systems emerge out of culture. And the particular economy that we live in today emerged out of a very interesting continuum, right? You know, and Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery is a great book to read about this. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a great book to read about this. Another book that I really enjoyed is The End of Growth by Richard Heinberg, because one of the things that Richard Heinberg does in the book is he talks about the growth, the formation of this economy, this particular economic system in which we live. So I say that to say this. Again, if we understand that at its core, an economy is a system that produces and distributes goods and services, we understand that different societies have answered the question of how such a system should work in different ways. African people, and then this is where Nyerere's point is really, really, really valuable. There is an ethos of communalism inherent in the social structure of traditional African society. And also classical African societies. You go back and you read texts in from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt, and one of the things that they talk about, like there's a text, the Egyptologist calls it the Negative Confessions. Maulana Karinga refers to it as, not Negative Confessions, the Declarations of Innocence. And it's a series of statements where the person they've died, they've gone into the afterlife. And they're saying all these things they have not done. I have not lied. I have not cheated. You keep reading these texts, you see a number of interesting things. They say, I have given bread to the hungry. You know, I have not deprived a widow of her riches, that a person who needed to ride the ferry across the river, I gave the money to take the ferry. Again, these are fundamentally statements that refer to types of economic relations. And so I would argue that one of the things that we see, which is an undercurrent throughout African cultures, throughout our history, is this ethos of communalism. This ethos that the economy should not only function for the interests of the wealthy and powerful, but it should function for all, that it should be a humanizing force. So with respect to our situation in the Americas, you know, and people have to understand that when we were brought, when our ancestors here, it's not as if they passed through some negative field that purged all their consciousness of who they are or who they were. You know, their minds weren't wiped. It wasn't like in Men in Black where they hold the
right.
That didn't happen. You know, they retained a sense of who they were, and they embedded that knowledge in their social structures. So when we talk about the Quilombos, I mean, like the economics of the Quilombos, and I don't know everything about their economies, but there are a couple of things about the Quilombos which are interesting to me. That on a certain level, one, they manifested the economic functions or structures that we see in traditional African societies. Food production, you know, for the collective. And this is actually a place where Nyerere's analysis is really valuable, because Nyerere doesn't just emphasize in terms of one's acquisition, but also one's contribution. So this idea of reciprocity in terms of the functioning of an economic system is exceedingly valuable. Again, it's not like this thing that we're in now, the system of hyperaccumulation, right? We have people who may do very little, but it will profit immensely. So you see that structure within the context of many of the Quilombos, whereby around just agriculture, people both grew food for themselves, but also for the larger community. And so if you think about these production systems, and this is important, because the food production system that enabled the producers to own what they produced stood in stark contrast to the system that most of them were escaping from in terms of the plantation, right? Mm-hmm. Here you have a system where the workers themselves, these enslaved Africans, were not the beneficiaries of their labor. And so this is important. We have to make note of this. They were, by instituting an African orientation or African-based system, or having an African value system inform their approach to economic development or economic production, they were in fact engaging in a type of resistance to the hyper-exploitative economic system that characterized the nature of the plantation. So that's one. But two, the other thing is this. They also, you know, these were also economic systems that were predicated, that were, as Bob will say, David Andrews Hutchinson talks about, these were wartime paradigms. So not only did they seek to maintain their own system so that they could sustain their own sovereignty, they also raided the enemy. You know, they raided the enemy. They would help people escape. They would steal, they would liberate resources,
right.
Would liberate tools. You know, they would sometimes sabotage the enemy and burn crops and things like that. So they were both acting in such a manner that enabled their economic functioning while attempting to undermine the functioning of the exploitative economic system which oppressed African people. And this is interesting. One of the things that H. Rap Brown talked about in his book, Die Nigga Die, he says that in a revolutionary context, the job of the revolutionary is to create a parallel structural framework, a parallel system of institutions that provides the needs to the people. So it's one thing for us to sit here and say to the people, you need to get an African-centered education. You need to get a cooperative economy. You need to get a system of government that affirms your dignity and humanity. It's another thing for us to build those systems and have those systems function. That way the people actually have an alternative. And then, you know, and I think H. Rap Brown's argument is that people would make an intelligent choice. They would choose the humane system over the hyper-exploitative system. And I think in many respects, our ancestors were actually doing the thing that the brother was talking about in the 60s. They were, in fact, building that system the economic system, and while also attempting to undermine and destroy the system of the enemy, because that was a system that was waging war against them. And so I say that to say that I think within the context of the Quilombos or the Maroon societies, they were called different things at different places, Quilombos, and in Brazil is what they were called. But I think the point is that these systems attempt to function in such a way to express values of reciprocity. Again, people contributed labor, people benefited from the bounty to achieve self-determination or self-sufficiency, whereby the people were able to support and sustain themselves, but also to undermine the exploitative system which existed, whose very existence is antithetical to the humanity of African people.
And so, to the question of sort of what do we do now, I know that in your reflection that you wrote today, you've talked about ways that we're attempting to build a new construct that has a different value set or a different value system. I'm trying to get at maybe a question of whether or not, it's form follows function, function follows form, so what has to change first? Do our values change before the system change? Do we institute new systems and then, we see values reflected there? I'm just, kind of wondering, up to myself and, inside of this conversation, what changes first?
Yeah. I appreciate that question. I think, it's this thing I used to, when I was younger, I realized this back in the 90s that a lot of the black organizations I encountered had what I call a contingent ideology. Contingent in the sense that they said that when this happens, we will do that. That when the people reach a certain level of consciousness, we will do X, Y, and Z. Or some, for religious groups, they might, when the Messiah comes, then this will happen. And I developed an aversion very early on to these contingent ideologies. Because I think that, as this is in Kawita theory, I think that people who are struggling for freedom have to move on every level to seize power. So for me, the process of resocialization, the changing of the values, preceding the process of the building institutions. I think they are entangled. I think they're entangled. I have believed for a very long time that Malcolm X and Malcolm X's impact, the type of transformation of the black consciousness that he achieved in the 1960s, was both profound and significant, but it also took us to the point where it demonstrated that we have reached the end of rhetoric as a basis of utility. By that I mean that I think Malcolm, what happened as a result of his ideas is that it informed the very nature of the Black Power movement that emerged subsequent to his death. And so if we look at the major strands of the movement, so-called cultural nationalism, those who advocated for cultural change, those who argued that we need land, that land was the basis of independence, or those that argued for revolution, those that argued that, in fact, what has to happen is that Africans have to topple the society and create an emancipatory order. I think that the formation, the continuum between the ideas of Malcolm X, and we're not even talking about the ideas that were formative for him, but Malcolm X himself and those things which emerged after him, I think demonstrated the appropriate trajectory for people who engage in liberatory struggle. I don't believe that it's necessary to go back to this point where we are reconceptualizing the ideas. I think the ideas have been conceptualized. I think now we're in the stage of implementation and execution. So I think that when we talk about changing the values of the people and building the structures, I think they have to be entangled, interrelated ends. So by that I mean this. My wife is an urban farmer, and Your Bountiful Harvest Family Farm. And I've been working with her in this kazi. Kazi is the Swahili word for work. We've been engaged in this kazi for some time now. The driving thrust behind this work has been this idea that African people need institutions to be free. The Council of Independent Black Institutions maintain that for African people to be free, for any people to be free, there are 6 basic levels of institution building. Education, clothing, housing, healthcare, food, and defense. So for us, the farm represents 2 of those. It represents certainly, obviously, the food system, because we're attempting, again, to create a context where we are providing and we're producing the food for ourselves that we need. We're producing for ourselves. We're consuming the food produced by ourselves, just like our ancestors did. But implicit within this, or rather, yes, both implicit within this, but also necessary to its success, is also the need to transform people's consciousness. There has to be a resocialization. There has to be a mechanism whereby we resocialize the people to understand that that this is necessary. That this is necessary. That in fact, one of the things that we've talked about, and we have to be much more deliberate about this, part of my argument has been that this is in fact the process of Re-Africanization. We talk about it. Cabral talks about this. Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers talked about this. Maulana Karingas talked about this. But in fact, I would argue that part of that Re-Africanization, a very direct and hands-on expression of it, is the work of food production, because our ancestors fed themselves. They didn't just drum and play dances. Drum and dance and go to the shrine. A lot of people talk that's part of it, but they also grew food. They fed themselves. So I would argue that the process of transforming the values and the consciousness and the process of building the structures has to be entangled, which means that for everything that we build, it has to be an educational component. Fred Hampton made the point that the people learn through observation and participation. And so that's the lesson. What do? We build. But we build things that people can participate in, and we build, attendant to those structures, mechanisms which can also be educated, which can also be facilitative of the transformation of their consciousness. And ultimately, we have to keep in mind that everything that we create has to be emblematic, or has to be representative of the world that we're attempting to bring into being. And this is why the structure of what we create is extremely important. We should be able to look at the work of any African in the world today, particularly those who are struggling, they would say, for liberation. We should be able to look at the structure and the models they created and say, if African people were free today under that model, these are the conditions we would live under. Right? I saw some crazy thing on YouTube earlier today. The videos come up. I didn't watch it, but it was a lady who posted a video that said a black pastor bought his wife a Lamborghini. And of course, she was critical of this. Again, the question we should ask, if that man ran a society in which we existed, what kind of society would that be? Because I would wager that everyone in his congregation does not have Lamborghinis. So that tells us a lot about the type of structure that the types of values that are operating and the type of structure that those values give rise to. So my point is that the systems that we create have to be systems that reflect particular value orientations, because that in and of itself is the lesson. That's why Ptahhotep said that a man teaches as he acts. He didn't say he teaches as he talks. That was given, but he teaches as he acts. And again, he or she, because people teach based through their actions, therefore our instructions, our structures, our institutions, our organizations, our models are in fact a sebayet. They are a type of instruction. Sebayet is the word teaching in ancient Middle Natural. Mm-hmm. So our institutions are in fact a sebayet. They are an instruction, a medium of instruction. So we cannot separate the people's values and the creation of the structures which enable us to be free. These works have to be entangled, which means that we have to pay very deliberate attention to what we create.
Indeed. Well, before I open up to the questions on the live, I just want to, read from the post that you made that I saw you'd been conversing with Baba Barudi, on Kujitwala, an African sovereigntist interpretation of the Nguzo Saba. And in next to Ujamaa, familyhood, we've got creating economic cooperatives based on the concept of African familyhood, interdependence, interrelationship, and village and national unity. And certainly, in terms of reading the writings of Nyerere, looking at the work of Tanzania, looking at sort of the sort of total transformation post-colonial, and certainly there was they were working in sort of post-colonial conditions, but also working in the context of a larger sort of capitalist world orientation that had its sort of thumb still kind of focused on them. But yeah. I think that, it's really a critical place for us to think about how cooperative economics exist as a social and economic development model, and for us to kind of invest in sort of thinking about what is sovereignty, what does autonomy look like, and what sort of values are we bringing into the economy that we as we move now in our personal space, but then also as we interlink and interconnect, and what Dr. Nembhard talked about is that solidarity commonwealth, so I appreciate all of the contributions you've offered towards that, and I'm just gonna just check in the live and just see if there are any questions for folks that folks have in the space at the moment. All right, so it looks like, yeah, we certainly, we've got Mama Sophia there, we've got Sister Lakashay, chiming in with a bit of right on. We've got, some of our other folks here in what I might call the extended family, of the nexus of, the Your Bountiful Harvest, Healthy Food Hub, Black Oak Center, all of these spaces, that we kind of all circulate around one another. Yeah, Sister Tequila, is on there. Nene Thompson, Brother Walter, Logan out there, Brother Sample, Julian Sample out there. So, yeah, if anyone has any questions that they want to offer to, myself, Baba Kamau here, please chime in, let us know what you want to hear about, what you're thinking about, or if you just are totally, as I am, kind of, invigorated and ready to kind of, dig into the work again, you can say that too. It's just the right on and Black power and Black unity there. All right, and while I'm checking in for those questions, I just also want to let everyone know that on Sunday, as we do on a bi-weekly basis, we've got that Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group. So the Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group is a space where we are deliberate and consistent in sitting down and unpacking these ideas around cooperative economics and around the cooperative traditions in the Black community, which I certainly think are rooted in a lot of what these practices that we've drawn over, we've brought with us across the Atlantic, these historical Africanisms. And so every time we had an opportunity to build a space that, we could liberate ourselves on an economic level, on a political level, we've utilized cooperation as a practice in order to extract the value and hold value and retain value in our communities. So Cooperation for Liberation Study and Working Group happens at the Breathing Room. That's 1434 West 51st Street, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. And, if you are interested in sort of cooperative development, if you're not necessarily interested in cooperative development, you're just coop curious, that's a space where conversation does happen, can happen. And what we've got coming up this coming series is we're going to be reading through cooperatives and economic development in Cuba. So that's a very thick, a pretty dense economic text. I had an opportunity to meet Raphael Betancourt, who's done some of the work around cooperative development in Cuba at Common Bound in St. Louis this year. So we're gonna dig into that. We're going to start studying the Collecting Ourselves cooperative curriculum, because effectively we want to have a curriculum around cooperative development that's focused on Black communities, spurring here in Chicago, and Cooperation for Liberation is a space where we can dig into that a bit. And again, if you are up, okay, let's see. We've got Walter Logan commenting, giving thanks for y'all sharing powerful lessons, giving thanks for the community, Black power. I see Sister Leslie Sharia's joined. I haven't seen that sister in a long time since the early days of the hub. Yeah, so, if you have any questions that you want to pose to Dr. Rashid, Dr. Kamau Rashid, the excellent scholar and practicing martial artists, and all of that inside of our community, please go ahead and post them in the comment section there. And as we are winding down, are there any other sort of reflections that you are thinking on in terms of this principle today? Things that maybe you're going to be digging into with the young people. I know that you and the young people get into some powerful discussions and lessons around around the principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We I think that one of the things that Ujamaa emphasizes, which I think is, when you look at the Nguzo Saba, when you go through the different principles, The one that has a very explicit institutional mandate is Ujamaa, which is unique in that way, because deals with it informs the type of value orientation in terms of how we operate with each other, and certainly that's undergirded by structures, by organizational structures. But I'm not sure if it has, but I think it's different in terms of the type of mandate relative to the institution building. Ujamaa has a very explicit institutional mandate. Ujamaa, I think, again, there's an aspect of that with respect to Ujamaa, but I think with Ujamaa it's very, very, very explicit. Kujichagulia, again, all the principles have this idea. There are things within every principle in the Saga which can be operationalized within the context of institutions, but Ujamaa in a very specific way articulates a type of a mandate which has to be expressed in the institutional form. It has to be expressed in structures which are part of the mechanism which we use to sustain ourselves. So one of the things that Nyerere, Julius Nyerere offers us a lot of lessons, right? One of the lessons that he offers us is the idea of self-sufficiency. And I don't mean self-sufficiency in the sense that we can feed ourselves only, but self-sufficiency in terms of our thinking, right? As a people, one of the problems that we suffer from, and this is everywhere we are in the world, we suffer from this idea that the path forward is in the footsteps of someone else, some other people, right? But not ourselves. So this idea of development, for instance, right, that in order for African economies to develop, they have to follow this model, this prescriptive model from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. State Department, and so forth. But we know that model doesn't work. We're told within the context of this society, with respect to education, right, if we want to learn that this is what learning looks like and it means these particular things, but there's profound de-education and miseducation of the black community. And so it would appear that these ideas from other people about education don't necessarily solve our problems. So Julius Nyerere teaches the lesson of self-sufficiency. The phrase that he popularizes, elimu, I think it was elimu kwa kujitegemea. Elimu is education, kwa for kujitegemea. Kujitegemea is self-reliance, not to be confused with kujichagulia, which is self-determination. So elimu kwa kujitegemea, education for self-reliance. One of the things that Nyerere was attempting to achieve was an education system that transformed the consciousness of the people so that they looked within at their capacity to create the future that they desired. It was, as Maulana Karenga says, to create the world they want and deserve to live in. That's something that we create. So I think Nyerere teaches us a lesson of self-sufficiency, that everything that we want to create, the world that we desire to live in, that is a world that can emerge from our hearts and minds if we are deliberate, if we are intentional, and if we are wise in terms of our implementation. And so I think that is a very important lesson, because I would argue that the dominant model, the dominant economic model, the dominant political model, the dominant educational model, the dominant health model, this entire system, I would argue, is bankrupt. And I don't mean bankrupt like it's out of money. It's awash with money. That's part of it. But it's a bankrupt system in terms of what it results in, which is the impoverishment of the human spirit. The impoverishment of the human spirit. So Nyerere makes the point that the economic system has to be one that not only provides for the needs of the people, but also facilitates reconnection. That's why that definition that you read, Mwalimu Rudy shared that, and that's from our very great elder, Mama Marimba Ani. That implicit in economic relations has to be this affirmation of our humanity. It has to facilitate unity, facilitate our connections to other people. This is at the heart of what Jacob H. Carruthers argued, that within the traditional African society, that within the culture and the organization of the traditional African society, there was no fundamental alienation. Fundamental alienation is what we have here. Whenever you can go to countries, I mean, like, this is the thing right now, you look at in parts of California, housing has gotten so expensive that people are renting spaces in parking lots. They're living in their vehicles, renting a space in a parking lot where they can reside, right? That's an example of a dehumanizing economy, where people can't even afford to have a place to live. And these are not, the word people use when I grew up, these are not bums, right? These are professionals. These are people who are nurses and teachers and other types of professions, but the cost of housing has exceeded the reach of the average person. That is a dehumanizing system. That is a system which produces fundamental alienation. A system economic system which is essentially at war with the people who exist within it. as an African people, not only is such a system antithetical to our values, but I would argue that to perpetuate such a system is antithetical to our potentiality. That part of our own economic system, but an economic system which is something I posted this morning, humanizing. Something which, to Mama Marimba's point, restores our connections to one another. And this is also the genius of Nyerere, because the word that's being used, and he talks about this in his essay, the word Ujamaa, the root of that word, I don't know if people are familiar with the language, but in Kiswahili, abstract nouns begin with U. So umoja is an abstract noun. The root of the word umoja is moja. Moja is one. That's literally the number one. Umoja is oneness, right? There was Baba Nubian Malik, when he was at Northeastern Illinois University, had a student organization called Utatu. Well, Tatu, the root of the word Utatu is Tatu. Tatu is three. You got Moja, Mbili, Tatu. Their student organization was Utatu. Utatu is threeness, or trinity, right? Ujamaa, the root of that word is Jamaa. Jamaa is family. So here you have an economic system of familyhood. What does that mean? This idea is that the economy should function in such a way that it creates, that it provides, that it facilitates the type of interrelations between people that restores the bonds of community, restores our sense of kinship with one another. A sense of kinship, a sense of connection is vitally important, especially for people engaged in the liberation struggle, right? We can't struggle and sacrifice. We can't give our lives, right, for those around us if we don't care about each other. And so part of the idea is to create a system, an economic system, which reinforce our deep sense of love for our fellow sisters and brothers. And so it's very ingenious. And so the point is that I think part of the challenge in the area is that we rethink what economic systems can achieve. That is not simply, and this is what I think is the deeper philosophical piece, that it wasn't simply that thing that's bound up in that definition of economy, again, the production and distribution of goods and services, but it's also that thing which facilitates the transformation and reorientation of value. It has to be noted, Nyerere is engaging in this work within a so-called post-colonial context, right? Our ancestors who built, as Nembhard attests, very audacious cooperative economic institutions. This is also within the context of neo-slavery, whatever you want to call this thing that we're in, whatever this is. But they were engaging in the production of institutions facilitated not only of their transformation, but also the assertion, the assertion of their humanity, and the inescapably communal nature of that humanity, which is a very, very African virtue.
Absolutely. And we did get a question there from Sister Safia. It says, what are strategies we can employ to get started on the path of Ujamaa? And then she threw in a sort of second addendum, institution building. And then Sister Lakashay noted, yes, the system is bankrupt on all levels. So just a bit of affirmation there. So in terms of strategies, did you want to speak to that at all?
Yes, sir. Yeah, and so I'll go back to what you raised earlier. We have to study. We have to study. Our institutions, everything that we create has to reflect the value system that we want to concretize in the world. Everything that we create has to concretize, has to facilitate, or has to express the value system which we seek to concretize in the world. This is part of the reason why when we talk about these great people, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and Amos Wilson has a wonderful essay about both of them in his book, New World Order, Pan-Africanism versus the New World Order, Garveyism in the Age of Globalism, because he refers to both of them as the true nationalists. Well, implicit within their work wasn't just creating the structures which enabled people to feed themselves and all that, but it was transforming their consciousness, transforming their values. So study is essential. We have to study. We have to get back to the thing that was actually very common when I was young, is study groups. I think that's one thing. But everybody's not going to participate in study groups. So that means that we have to be creative in terms of how we present information to people, how we get these ideas across to people. So I think that's one thing. We have to engage in the concerted effort, a concerted campaign, a concerted propaganda campaign. And I'm not using propaganda in the bad way, right?
Yes.
Because we're bombarded with propaganda. Every time I'm on the L train and I see those ads, right? And I'm watching TV and I'm on YouTube, right? That's propaganda. Yeah. And I'm talking about the propaganda that we use to make particular ideas, to embed particular ideas in the consciousness of people, right? Certainly. Ideas that they might not otherwise encounter. So I think that we have to be increasingly, always sophisticated in terms of how we create context for people to engage in ideas related to this. And part of the conversation, and this is why I think your work is so valuable, part of the conversation about Ujamaa isn't just giving them an economics education, right? That's part of it, to be sure. They have to understand what an economy is, how economies work, what are the different types of economies which existed and which can exist. But part of it also has to be these conversations around values, you know. And of course, we in the black community, we're awash with values discourses. And many of them very good, many of them very, very positive, right? And I think it's a matter of showing the interrelation between those values and economic development. So that's one. Two, we have to support those. We have to support and build the structures which we need. You know, so let's start with the easy thing. The easy thing is supporting the institutions which already exist. What are those institutions which exist in our community which enable us to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, house ourselves, educate ourselves, you know, heal ourselves and defend ourselves? What are those structures and how do we support those structures? And so we have to be very intentional, very deliberate in our community, investing in those institutions, especially those institutions that reflect those types of value orientations. So that's one. And so this whole campaign about buying black is a necessary part of it, but it's also a small part of it. And the Sister Tequila Shabazz is very deliberate about pointing that out, that when we talk about liberation and we talk about economic liberation, it's not just black consumerism, right? My wife told me something just a little while ago about some acts of hedonistic, conspicuous consumption. I don't want people to get it twisted. That's conspicuous consumption is consumption beyond your basic needs. That's the lady, and I no offense to the ladies and the brothers, because the brothers are into this now too, right? They have like 1,000 pairs of shoes, you know, right? The guys who collect the shoes, and the ladies who have shoes for every outfit. And again, I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm not making that argument. But I'm just saying that's conspicuous consumption. That's what it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know,
liberation for us can't be conspicuous consumption. Yeah, it has to be us building the institutions and supporting those institutions which are concerned about facilitating our economic liberation. And then third is building the structures that we require. Building the structures. And so with respect to, you know, like I was on a panel 2 days ago, we were talking about languages. There's a fervent interest in many sectors in our community around African languages. And many of us have come to the conclusion that the only way this is going to happen is if we create those structures. That's an economic institution. Right, see, both the educational and economic, because it's going to take some labor to sustain this. The agricultural piece is a lot of great energy, whether it's my wife's work, whether it's Soil Lucian's work, whether it's the work that the sister Abena, Jacqueline Smith is doing, their community gardens, and Brother Pancho. I mean, there's a lot of the Black Oak Center for Sustainable and Renewable Living. There's a lot of people doing some really audacious work around food production. This work has to be supported and sustained, but we also have to look at what are the other sectors. One of the emergent spaces, and this is something that Barbara Frere's been raising for a while, is textiles. Again, one of those levels of institution building is closed. We have to get into textile production. Mm-hmm. And so this whole thing that's happening right now with the legislation around hemp is something we should be paying very close attention to, because this opens up a new area. This is a space where we can create new institutions. Are we creating clothes so that people can buy trendy fashions that will be out of fashion in 6 months? No, we're creating clothes so that black people can wear underwear that they made. You know, I remember I went to a lecture by Minister Louis Farrakhan back in the 90s, and he talked about we need to get our own hands on you, right? And so our own socks, our own underwear, our own shoelaces. And so, again, what we don't have, we have to create. So, again, we do have to educate our people, and we need to devise every available means to do that. We have to support those existing economic structures which are concerned about our self-determination, our liberation, and we have to create the structures which we don't have, which are vital to our survival, and we have to be deliberate and intentional about it.
Absolutely. And, you know, I'll just highlight, you know, one element that I've spoken to before in terms of the study group and the value of just, you know, the value of just coming together at some points, right? So there was an incident, you know, that occurred in the study group where, you know, one of our members, actually this was on a Cooperation for Liberation piece of footage that I released on an interview with that same sister, Davine. And Davine, you know, after we got to the Collective Courage text, she asked a very deliberate question, like, do we ever win? You know, like she was disheartened, like she was dejected having gotten through all of these stories of, you know, I mean, our attempts to build these cooperative structures and then them being knocked over. And, you know, and she was like, do we ever win? And what happened in that moment is that we went around the circle, and every person in that circle said, you know, when I feel most disheartened about what's going on within our space, here's what I do. Here's what I draw upon. Here's what I'm invested in, right? So, I mean, effectively, you know, you're throwing energy at someone who is, you're building those kinship ties, right? In a very moment where you think, you know, that this is supposed to be like, you know, this very thick, you know, educational space. I mean, you know, an erudite. No, what we're doing is we're relationship building in the space, and that provides the rocket fuel for other things that happen later. So, you know, I mean, there are other structures that come later that are going to need those relationship ties. We need to pull in those kinship ties, but we won't have them if we're kind of only coming together when there's time to do work. And then we do the work, and then we go home, and then, you know, we don't see each other, right? You know, I mean, we need those relational ties. Otherwise, you know, we don't know why we're building collectively. We don't know why we're trying to, you know, assemble together. And definitely to your point about propaganda, you know, I mean, I know that from very real experience, and I shared this in the permaculture course with the students of the Black Oaks Permaculture Lifeboat series, where when I initially went out around this idea around time banking, I thought I was going to go out and hit the lecture circuit, and I was going to give, you know, 5 lectures, and every organization was going to say, that's fantastic. We all need social currency, you know? And I mean, and it falls on dead ears because, I mean, you know, to your point, you know, it's not necessarily about what the talk is doing, you know? I mean, it's about what the legs are doing. And so, in revitalizing the strategy, you know, I then went out later and I was like, okay, I'm going to embed myself in these different spaces, and I'm going to go on a listening tour, and I'm going to see what spaces need. Now, what I found is that it transformed me because being in the space actually said that, you know, I need to have a different analysis about what I'm talking about here, what I'm selling here, what I'm pitching here. And then that changes the plan. You know, I mean, this is the plan that I thought I was going to do, but this is not ambitious enough. You know, it needs to actually it needs to transform structures. You know, I mean, so Dr. Nembhard often talks about cooperatives don't transform structures or transform governance until we actually make them transformative structures. So, you know, I'm definitely, you know, I'm engaged in that propaganda conversation and that educational study group space conversation. Yes.
And that's just to raise a powerful, do we ever win? And I would argue that it's a powerful question. And I think that we have to remember it is not in the African worldview, and this is true of many cultures, but in the African worldview, like separation is an illusion. And that's really has to be understood. In the African way of seeing things, separation is an illusion. And that's why I so like the separation, and this is what I wrote yesterday about Ujamaa. This is, if you're interested, anybody wants to read this at KamauRashid.com. And it was about Ujamaa, and I made the connection between the individual and the society. The African worldview, they're entangled. We can't talk about the individual without talking about the society. And the society is made up by individuals, and Nyerere talks about that. My point is that when we talk about victory, the means and the end are entangled. Right? The means and the end are interconnected. For the act of winning the war and attaining our liberation, that act, that victory is implicit in every moment of resistance. Every moment of resistance. Right? And so we are constantly winning. We are constantly winning. We just have to be resolved to continue to win. Continue to struggle for victories. Every single act of resistance is a victory, and every single act of resistance is legitimate with respect to to the war. But we have to remember, every single act of resistance is a victory.
And that is a fantastic note to close upon. You know, every single act of resistance is a victory, so we always winning. Be resolved to continue winning. To the point, I often, you know, throw a quote out there about from movement generation. You know, we don't need experts to interpret the economy for us. We live the economy every day. We live the economy in our families. You know, we know what we need, and we simply have to be resolved to kind of, you know, pursue those needs in a way that actually is sustainable, continuous, democratic, participatory, and ongoing. So I really appreciate the conversation, brethren. You know, and yes, I look forward to many more, you know, conversations in the context of nation and institution building. And yes, you know, I really appreciate your scholarship and your work, your kazi, so all of that.
Sante-san, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed having this conversation as well. Thank you.
All right. And be well, brethren. Tutu Anana.
All right, Tutu Anana.